Buried in snow, a freak storm slams the Great Lakes snowbelt, with more on the way. Executive action. The president is poised to act on immigration. A border state congressman weighs in. Deep concern. Pope Francis warns against the growing tide of violence in the Holy Land. And seeking calm. A Catholic police chaplain works to avert more violence in suburban St. Louis. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, November 19th, 2014. Good evening from Washington. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. President Obama is expected to announce executive action on immigration as he addresses the nation tomorrow night. The administration's plan could shield 5 million immigrants now living illegally in the U.S. from deportation.
Everybody agrees that our immigration system is broken. Unfortunately, Washington has allowed the problem to fester for too long. And so what I'm going to be laying out is the things that I can do with my lawful authority as president to make the system work better, even as I continue to work with Congress and encourage them to get a bipartisan, comprehensive bill that can solve the entire problem.
The White House released that video this afternoon, and talk of the executive action by the president is bringing both praise and criticism. Let's go to Chief White House correspondent Suzanne LaFranchi for reaction tonight. Suzanne?
Good evening, Brian. Well, the president has been threatening since this summer that if Congress did not act, he would. Many Republicans are saying the executive order is not only unconstitutional, but it is bad public policy. Meanwhile, the Democratic leadership is about to arrive here at the White House. They've been invited to have dinner with the president to discuss details of the plan. No Republicans were invited.
Is going to go out there and act like a king or an emperor instead of acting like a president.
Many Republicans, like Representative Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee, are vehemently opposed to the president's likely action. She says she and her colleagues are already planting a counter-legislative attack.
Looking at the legal, judicial, legislative, budgetary components that are available to us to play some block and tackle.
A wide-ranging immigration bill passed in the Democratic-controlled Senate last year, but stalled in the Republican-led House. Obama dropped the immigration issue until after the midterm elections, partly because of its unpopularity in some legislative districts. Yesterday, the Congressional Women's Working Group on Immigration Reform called on the president to protect the parents of so-called dreamers from deportation. Democrat Zoe Lofgren of California says Congress has ignored the issue for far too long.
The president has an obligation to make sure that the system works as well as possible. They can supersede his action by passing a law, but we've waited long enough.
Gracia Martinez crossed the Rio Grande with her parents from Mexico when she was 2 months old. She is a dreamer, one of the undocumented children who were spared deportation from the president's 2012 executive action. But her father was deported 6 years ago.
I need to make sure that my mother stays at home with my sisters and I, and that our family doesn't, go through the pain that we went through 6 years ago again.
Word is that Republicans are deeply divided on how to respond to the president's executive order. Some conservative members are calling for a government shutdown or threatening that. However, House Majority Leader John Boehner said that is not going to happen on his watch. Back to you, Brian.
All right, Suzanne LaFranchi reporting from the White House tonight. Texas Congressman Henry Cuellar joining us from Capitol Hill, a member of the House Appropriations Committee and representing constituents on the border with Mexico. The president will address the nation tomorrow night. Do you expect him to invoke executive action, and does he have the authority to do that on immigration?
Yes, I think he is going to do that tomorrow in Las Vegas. And does he have the authority? I think if you look at the history, the precedent that has been set by so many Democrats and Republican presidents, he does have the executive order. I prefer to have a immigration reform through Congress. But if you look at what President Ronald Reagan and Bush 1 did, they did exactly the same thing. They used an executive order for immigration so they could, for immigration purposes, to give a reprieve of people that were about to be deported.
So we're told that about 5 million immigrants could be granted amnesty. Could that not open a whole nother set of problems?
Well, first of all, this is not amnesty. What President Ronald Reagan did in 1986 in the Democratic Congress, that was amnesty. This is just allowing a suspension of deportation while hopefully Congress will do something. So he's not going to impose a classification on these people, on these folks. All he's going to do is just suspend or provide a reprieve of deportation like President Ronald Reagan and President George Bush I did some years ago.
How do you think a bipartisan solution would look, and is it even possible?
It is possible, and I think if Congress does the same thing when Ronald Reagan did its executive order back in the 1980s, and then Congress came back and did a change on the law, I think that's what we ought to do. If Congress doesn't like what the president's doing, let's get back to the legislative process. I believe in immigration reform, sensible immigration reform, bipartisan immigration reform, and I think we can do it if we sit down together.
There's rumblings that the Republicans could try to shut down the government again in response to this. Does it feel at all like immigrants are being used as pawns in a very powerful chess match?
I think it would be a mistake for the Republicans to close down the government. We saw what happened last year. They shut down the government. We had all this problems for weeks, and then after a while, we ended back in the same place that we started. The budget is one of the most basic responsibilities of the U.S. Congress. Let's do the budget. If we have a policy debate, let's look at legislation and let's do it separately from closing down the budget. I can think of so many things that I disagree, but I'm not going to say let's close the government because I have a policy disagreement.
Well, let's see what the president says and how Congress reacts after that announcement tomorrow. Texas Congressman Henry Cuellar, thanks for joining us from Capitol Hill tonight.
Thank you so much.
Now some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. There was heavy security as prayers resumed today at a Jerusalem synagogue following a brutal attack, leaving 5 people dead. It was the first time worshipers gathered since 4 rabbis and a police officer were killed. Yesterday's attack came after weeks of violence linked to a disputed holy site sacred to Jews and Muslims. Palestinians have been angered over Israeli visits to the site, many seeing them as a provocation. 11 people have died at the hands of Palestinian attackers in recent weeks, most of them in Jerusalem, but also in Tel Aviv and in the West Bank. Meanwhile, Israel demolished the home of a Palestinian who carried out a deadly October attack. Israeli security forces are under orders to strike back at Palestinians involved in violence against Israelis. They've also been told to resume other home demolitions, a deeply controversial tactic. The Holy Father is condemning the brutal attack. He calls on Israelis and Palestinians to make peace. You'll recall Francis hosted the Israeli and Palestinian presidents last summer for peace prayers in the Vatican gardens. At his general audience today, he says he is praying for all of the victims of the synagogue murders. The Pope focused his weekly talk on the universal call to holiness. He says holiness is not just for a few, but a gift offered to all. Pope Francis told the crowd in St. Peter's Square that everyone is called to be a saint. Senate Democrats strike down the Keystone pipeline legislation as one of their final acts before Republicans have the majority in the Senate. The bill fell 1 vote short of the 60 votes needed last night. GOP leaders vow to take up the measure immediately next year when they'll likely have enough votes to pass it. What's not clear is there chance of overriding an expected presidential veto. Democrats remain concerned about the bill's environmental impact. Republican supporters say the project is good for the economy.
It is about energy. It is about jobs. It is about economic growth, and it is about national security by building a secure energy future for this country and not depending on the Middle East for our energy.
That pipeline would carry crude oil from Canada through Middle America to Gulf Coast refineries. The Keystone vote is a harsh blow to Louisiana Democrat Mary Landrieu, who was working to drum up her party's support for that bill. It's a high-stakes issue for voters in Louisiana, where the oil and gas industry dominates the economy. Landrieu pinned her hopes of winning a runoff election next month on championing the bill during this lame duck Congress. Her failure to rally enough votes looks to improve Republican Representative Bill Cassidy's chances of winning her Senate seat. Well, winter storms and bitter cold grip much of the nation tonight. More than 5 feet of snow has fallen near the Great Lakes, with even more on the way. Wyatt Goolsby is here tonight with the latest.
And Brian, at this point, 6 people have died as a result of the snowstorms. Most of that has left the Northeast covered in snow and resulted in freezing temperatures in all 50 states. Some of the worst of it here in the U.S. has been in Buffalo, New York. They've had 6 feet of snow, with more on the way. A state of emergency has been declared for parts of New York State, and the National Guard deployed. Buffalo's mayor says more than 5,000 tons of snow has been removed, but their work is far from done. Residents south of downtown Buffalo are still trying to clear paths.
It's too much. It's just really a lot of snow here, and it's hard to. We're closed in here. It's not an open area where you can just fling the snow anywhere. You got houses, and snow blowers only go so high with the snow, so you're kind of restricted, but you just do what you have to do.
We've also learned Catholic schools and churches have closed today due to the storms and hazardous road conditions. Members of the Diocese of Buffalo today asked for prayers. Friends of Niagara University, a private Catholic college, were glad to see members of the women's basketball team made it home after their team bus got stuck in the snow. This tweet from one of the players went viral last night of them praying on the bus. Emergency officials made sure the team got home early this morning. The winter weather across the country is due to a blast of Arctic air that is pouring over the Great Lakes, producing extreme conditions. All 50 states registered temperatures below freezing yesterday morning, and while it's better today, it is below average for this time of the year. Some of the lows tonight show Tallahassee, Florida at 23, Chicago at 29, and Salt Lake City at 30 degrees. Another round of Arctic air will likely hit tomorrow and Friday, which could drop 2 to 3 additional feet of snow. So, Brian, it's a situation we'll continue to follow.
It's awfully early for wintry weather like that, Wyatt. Thank you. Coming up, a congressional grilling for the new head of the Secret Service. Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday evening. I'm Brian Patrick, and Congress gets a chance to ask the acting Secret Service director about his troubled agency. Joseph Clancy acknowledged the agency fell short, allowing an intruder to enter the White House in September. He admitted the incident demonstrated immediate action to correct agency problems is needed. He also said agents are suffering from low morale. House members told Clancy absolutely no mistakes can be made in protecting the president. Some asked why no agents have been disciplined over misleading the public about the severity of that security breach. Well, gun shop owners in the St. Louis area say they're selling out of supplies. This disturbing news as Ferguson awaits a grand jury decision on the officer who fatally shot 18-year-old Michael Brown this past summer. One store has sold 2 or 3 times more weapons in recent weeks than usual, 30 to 50 guns per day. Protest leaders say they're preparing for nonviolent demonstrations, but they warn that there's a risk of more violence if the panel doesn't indict Officer Darren Wilson on criminal charges. Joining us, Father Mike Boehm, chaplain for the St. Louis County Police. He's been on the ground in Ferguson. And Father, you've been ministering to the police force there. Can you give us a sense of what these officers have been grappling with over these past few months?
Well, they have a whole lot of pressure on them from many different angles, not the least of which is they're working 12-hour days with no days off. At least they were when the command post was set up and in operation. They're looking at probably the same kind of pressures coming up as soon as the grand jury releases its decision. So there's a lot of, it just becomes tense. It becomes difficult for them, especially with their families. And you can imagine all the things that don't get done, you know, or the jobs that don't get shared in terms of kids going to practices or recitals and homework and all of those different things that need to be done at home that usually you count on as a team. And a lot of times now the officer side of that is gone because he or she has to work all the time.
Very interesting. You remind us that police are people too, and they have families and they have children. And there in Ferguson, you were on the ground at the peak of the violence this summer. How are things there now? How would they compare today? Is that tension still there?
In Ferguson, surely it is. It's not as intense as it was, but the tension is still there. And our parishes in Ferguson, we have 2, are really doing a great job of keeping at the forefront of people's minds the need to pray for peace, the need to be people of peace, the need to work for peace. So, you know, our task as a church is ongoing. and they've been doing a great job.
So we as Christians, as Catholics, we're really called to move towards forgiveness and mercy. Do you think the people who live in Ferguson and around there are craving for that, or is there a prevailing movement more toward violence and peace?
Oh, absolutely. I think that people there would love to have this resolved. I always think of it in terms of this, as a people of faith, we're called to bring good out of bad situations. And obviously our hearts all go out to Michael Brown's family and his loved ones. And so any work that can be done to help in any way, any work that can be done to bring some good out of this horrible tragedy is going to be a huge benefit for everybody. And the people of Ferguson, that's what they want at the end of the day. Nobody wants to live in an area where it's torn by strife. They want peace and they want to get along, and that's what people are called to do.
Well, thank God for the church and its presence there and this call for peace. Be assured of our prayers as you continue with your work ministering to the St. Louis County Police Department there. Thank you so much for joining us, Father Mike Boehm.
Thank you.
And up next, for the first time, a layperson is in charge of the Vatican's finances. Thanks for joining us on this Wednesday, the 19th of November. I'm Brian Patrick. The Pentagon is scaling back its Ebola aid plans for West Africa. The U.S. planned on sending 4,000 troops, but will cut that number by 1,000. A total of 10 treatment centers will be built rather than the possible 17. The military won't say why it's reducing the number of treatment centers or troops deployed. However, the number of infections in some parts of West Africa have fallen recently. Separately, the CDC says its worst-case prediction, pegged at 1.4 million Ebola cases, isn't likely to happen. The agency's director isn't revising the number just yet. He says, though, the earlier figures came at the height of the outbreak before international medical aid began arriving in West Africa. The Catholic Church and the Ministry of Health in Kenya announcing a joint test on tetanus vaccines. The test will determine if the vaccine contains a hormone that prevents pregnancy. Kenyan bishops raised concerns after a national tetanus campaign targeted women of childbearing age. Kenya's medical services and church officials met today to decide where and how testing will be executed. Well, it is a first for the Vatican, a layperson appointed to oversee the Vatican's finances. The Vatican announcing today that René Brulhart will head a panel to guard against money laundering and financing of terrorism. The panel also oversees all business conducted with the Vatican. According to Italian news outlet Vatican Insider, Brulhart is a Swiss lawyer. The Vatican's conference on supporting marriage is wrapping up today in Rome. Experts from different faith traditions are highlighting the beauty of the natural relationship between man and woman. We're blessed to be joined by Sister Prudence Allen with the International Theological Commission, connected with the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. Sister Prudence, your involvement there in this conference on the complementarity of man and woman in marriage, why do you think that it's so important for the Church and other religious organizations from around the world gathered there in Rome to really be clear about what true marriage is?
Well, what happened in this extraordinary conference is we had people from 13, 15, 17 different religions and 30 different countries all sharing what marriage means in their own religious tradition. It was really an astounding experience, and to discover the great variety and richness of the impact of marriage. One of the things that came out, which was particularly impressive to me, was the impact on children of having a mother and a father, and grandparents and intergenerational relations in the family, and how families that broke up or where there were single parents, or in some cases we find today people actually wanting a child where there's no marriage involved between a man and a woman, the child's really deprived of basic right, which is to have a mother and a father. And it harms the children, and it seems as though the mothers in many of those single families go into poverty. Boys growing up in those families can often become very troubled by not having a father. So what we came to is the sense that this was the relationship that God started, at least in our Catholic tradition, in the book of Genesis. He provided the 5 sort of basic components of complementarity, which is equal dignity, significant difference, synergetic relation, and intergenerational fruition. And we looked at some of the influences that are coming up against that and ways in which the traditions are recovering the deep, beautiful experience of the strength that marriages have. So
well, I know that you've done a great deal of research.
I think we all strengthen one another.
I know you've done a great deal of research on this topic, Sister, and I just wonder from a very practical standpoint, how do you think the results of this conference, what has been discussed and what will go out from here, will really affect this this erosion and the efforts to redefine marriage as something other than between a man and a woman?
I think that in a lot of different ways. One is it's given a lot of confidence to the people who came here. But in a practical way, in my own presentation, I talked about the use of the word gender. And I talked about how the word has been, in a certain way, kidnapped and taken to imply 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 genders, when in fact, really, gender in its very simple, basic meaning, taken from the meaning of gens, or to reproduce, comes from the book of Genesis. It means basically that males and females, men and women, who are for the most part the way human beings are born and grow up, they are the basic genders, two genders.
A simple truth in a complicated world. Sister Prudence Allen with the International Theological Commission joining us from Rome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Well, you may not be thinking of Christmas just yet. Advent hasn't even started. The U.S. Postal Service, though, is gearing up, unveiling this year's religious Christmas stamp. Jason Calvi reports.
The three kings of Orient are now gracing envelopes all across the United States. And U.S. postal officials say these stamps will traverse afar.
For a normal stamp, we issue anywhere from 20 to 40 million stamps. For the Magi stamp, we've issued 200 million.
One Maryland resident is grateful to have a religious stamp option.
We want to keep Christ in Christmas. After all, I am Catholic.
Louis Giuliano, who serves on the Post Office Board of Governors, says he'll use the Christmas stamps year-round.
When I use them, it reminds me of this special time of the year, this joyous season, and the meaning of it all, and why we have Christmas and what we're really celebrating.
According to the Smithsonian National Postal Museum, the first Christmas stamp was issued in the 1960s. In 1966, famous renditions of the Madonna and Child began to be used.
And stamp collectors have fancy names. What are you called?
We're philatelists.
Philatelists. And today, this philatelist adds the kings and the star they followed to her growing stamp collection.
And you may wonder how stamps are even chosen. Well, the Postal Service has a Citizens Advisory Committee that they pick, and then the Postmaster General then has the final say. And Brian, if you have an idea for a stamp, you can actually submit it directly to the Postal Service. They get about 20 to 30,000 recommendations each year.
Good. I have an idea for a Jason Calvi stamp.
I don't think that's going to get approved anytime soon, Brian.
Thank you, Jason. Until tomorrow, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, watch again anytime you like on EWTN's YouTube page. For all of us at EWTN News Nightly, I'm Brian Patrick. Thank you so much for watching tonight. Good night and God bless you.